The farmer's horses suddenly refused to drink from his pond. At first, he thought it was just the heat or the animals being picky, but after a few days he realized something was wrong. So he decided to drain the pond and see what was hiding at the bottom. What he discovered left everyone truly shocked. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning light rolled gently across the wide plains of southern Montana, spreading over the dry hills like a pale golden tide. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, but the heat was already building, pressing down on the earth with a dry, breathless weight. Dust shimmered above the hard soil, rising from the tracks of an old pickup truck parked near a weathered barn. The ranch lay silent except for the faint hum of insects and the distant creak of a windmill struggling to catch the sluggish breeze. Eli Brown stood near the corral fence, resting his rough hands on the top rail. His palms were calloused from decades of work, and the sun had long since burned his skin into a deep bronze tone. He had lived on this land all his life. It wasn't much by anyone else's measure: 24 head of cattle, a few sturdy horses, and the old farmhouse his grandfather had built back when this part of the state was still wilderness. To Eli, it was everything. Every fence post and faded gate held a memory. Every sound of wind in the dry grass carried the weight of generations. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve and turned toward the barn. Inside, his favorite mare, a dark chestnut named Sandra, was pawing gently at the straw. She was 12 years old now, still strong and proud, with a white streak along her muzzle that made her look perpetually wise and defiant. Eli spoke softly to her, more out of habit than need. She had been with him through fires, storms, and droughts, and he often joked that she understood more about this land than he ever would. It had been a hard summer. The rains had come late, then stopped altogether. The grass was brittle and yellow, and the creek that once ran behind the property had dwindled to a trickle. Only the large pond behind the barn, fed by a slow underground spring, had held steady. It was old, older than the ranch itself, according to his grandfather. Over the years it had become the heart of the place, a mirror of the sky where animals came to drink and the world seemed to slow down. But something had changed. It began 2 days ago on a Tuesday morning, no different from any other. Eli led Sandra down to the pond after a long ride along the fence line. The mare walked beside him calmly, tail flicking at flies, her hooves stirring tiny clouds of dust. But as they neared the water, she suddenly stopped. Her ears went flat and her muscles tensed. She let out a short, uneasy snort and refused to take another step. Eli frowned, tugging lightly at the reins, thinking maybe she'd seen a snake or smelled a coyote. The pond surface was perfectly still, gleaming under the sun like a sheet of glass. Nothing stirred. "Come on, girl," he muttered, leading her forward. But Sandra planted her hooves and jerked her head back, pulling hard enough to nearly break free. It startled him. He had never seen her act that way, not even when a thunderstorm rolled in or a wild dog strayed too close. She was trembling. He finally gave up, loosening the reins and letting her back away. She trotted a few paces off, breathing heavily, watching the pond as if it were alive. Eli approached the water himself, crouching at the edge. The surface was clean, clear, with a few ripples from the wind. He dipped his hand and tasted it out of curiosity. It was cool, maybe a little earthy, but nothing unusual. When he turned around, Sandra was still standing there, uneasy. He shrugged it off as a strange mood. The next morning, it happened again. And the day after that. Eli tried everything he could think of, leading her at different times of day, filling buckets from the pond, even mixing the water with feed. Each time, she refused. The other horses still drank, though less eagerly than usual. The cows came and went without hesitation, but Sandra would rather go thirsty than touch that water. By the third day, he began to feel something he hadn't felt since childhood, an uneasy chill that crept beneath his skin despite the heat. It wasn't fear exactly, but a kind of intuition, the same sense that made the animals flee before a storm. The ranch was quiet that day. No birds circled the pond, no dragonflies danced above it, not even the usual hum of crickets in the reeds. Only the wind moved, bending the brittle grass around the edges. He thought of his grandfather again, old Henry Brown, who had bought this land for pennies after the nearby mining company went bankrupt. Henry used to tell him stories about how he dug the first well by hand, how he found the pond already there, full and deep. "Never trust what sits too still," the old man once said, half joking as he cleaned his rifle. "Still water can hide more than fish." That evening, Eli sat on the porch watching the last light fade over the hills. The world around him was painted in amber and shadows. Sandra grazed near the fence, restless, her ears twitching at every sound. From where he sat, the pond was a dark oval in the earth, smooth and reflective like a black mirror. It looked harmless, peaceful even, but he couldn't shake the image of Sandra pulling away, eyes wide with something that wasn't fear. It was knowing. He turned in early that night but couldn't sleep. His mind kept circling back to the pond. What if something had fallen in? A dead animal, maybe? He'd seen that happen before. Decomposition could foul the water fast. He decided he'd check it at dawn, maybe drain a little, just to see. Before dawn, he was already outside, the air cool and sharp. He walked down the slope toward the pond with a lantern in one hand, his boots crunching softly against the dirt. The water glimmered faintly under the first light of morning, smooth as oil. A faint metallic tang hung in the air, one he'd never noticed before. He crouched again, dipping the lantern low. The bottom was invisible, swallowed by darkness. He felt a strange sense of unease, as though something beneath the surface was aware of him. He stood and backed away slowly. When the light rose fully, he saw that the reeds near the western edge were yellowing, almost burnt-looking. Even the cattails drooped as if poisoned. He walked along the bank and realized the soil there was slick, oily. The same smell lingered, metallic, chemical, wrong. Eli straightened up, breathing heavily. This was no animal carcass, no trick of the heat. Something was wrong with the pond itself. But how could that be? This was spring-fed water, steady and clear for generations. His grandfather had watered crops and livestock here for 50 years. His father, before the accident, had done the same. There had never been a problem. The unease grew heavier as the day wore on. He told himself it was probably harmless, some natural change underground, minerals leaching in maybe. Still, the taste of that water lingered on his tongue, faint and bitter like rust. He spat into the dust and looked toward Sandra. She was standing by the fence, watching him, her body tense. Their eyes met for a moment, and he thought he saw something there, some instinctive warning. That night, the silence was unbearable. No frogs croaked by the water. The crickets had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to die before reaching the pond. Eli sat by the window, staring into the darkness until his eyes burned. His mind kept replaying that scene, the way Sandra refused to drink, the metallic sheen on the water, the smell he couldn't name. He felt the weight of his grandfather's words again. Still water can hide more than fish. When dawn finally came, Eli made up his mind. He would drain part of the pond, maybe half of it, enough to see the bottom. It would take time, but it wasn't impossible. He had the equipment and the will. If something was poisoning his land, he needed to know. He saddled up the truck, drove into town, and rented a portable pump from the construction supply yard. The clerk asked what he needed it for, and Eli simply said, "Water management." He didn't mention the horses, the smell, or the silence. The man would only laugh like the rest of them would. Driving back along the dirt road, Eli looked out over the land. The sun was higher now, harsh and pitiless. The fields stretched endlessly in all directions, golden and dry, the ranch houses scattered like islands in a sea of dust. To anyone else it looked peaceful, timeless, but to Eli it suddenly felt fragile, as if one wrong move could break the illusion of safety that generations before him had believed in. When he parked near the barn and looked toward the pond again, it seemed to shimmer faintly under the noon light, the surface flawless, almost inviting. He knew better now. Sandra stood nearby, ears pricked, tail flicking nervously. As he watched her, she turned her head away from the pond, snorting once as if in final protest. Eli exhaled slowly. The decision was made. Tomorrow he would begin. And somewhere beneath that calm, mirror-like surface, something waited. The morning after he brought the pump home, the ranch felt heavier than usual. The air hung thick with heat, and even the windmill's groan sounded tired. Eli sat on the porch steps, sipping lukewarm coffee from an old tin mug, watching the shimmer of the pond at a distance. Sandra grazed in the pasture, still keeping her distance from the water's edge. It had been nearly a week now since she last drank from it. Every day she looked thinner, her coat duller, her steps slower, yet she still refused to take even a sip. He had tried everything he could think of, leading her gently by the reins, coaxing her with apples, even waiting until nightfall to see if she might drink under the cover of darkness. But nothing changed. It was as if something deep inside her knew that the pond had turned against them. That morning, Eli decided he could no longer ignore it. The pump could wait a few hours. He needed to know whether Sandra was sick. He saddled the old truck, the same one that had belonged to his father, and drove the dusty 20 miles into town to see Dr. Roberts, the local veterinarian. The drive was slow and rattling, past endless fields of brown grass and abandoned barns, remnants of better years. By the time he pulled into the clinic's gravel lot, the sun had climbed high enough to bleach the sky to white. Dr. Roberts was a tall, thin man with a beard that made him look perpetually half asleep. He had known Eli since childhood, treated his livestock for decades. When Eli explained the situation, how the mare refused to drink, how she trembled near the water, the vet nodded thoughtfully but didn't seem alarmed. "Heat stress, maybe," he said. "Horses get funny in droughts. Water might be too warm or taste off. Try moving her to the north well for a while." He offered to stop by the ranch later that week to check her lungs and gums, just in case. Eli left with a knot in his stomach. The vet's calmness didn't match what he'd seen in Sandra's eyes. There was something more than heat stress behind that fear. As he drove back, he remembered how she'd reacted when he tried to pour pond water into a bucket, jerking her head away, snorting, almost rearing. She wasn't just refusing, she was rejecting it with instinctive dread. By late afternoon, he was back at the ranch. The wind had died completely, and the sun beat down on the land until even the shadows seemed to curl up and hide. The pond glistened under the weight of that heat, a perfect mirror of the sky, blue and innocent-looking. He filled a small pail and carried it back toward the stables. Sandra was waiting in her stall, ears twitching. When he offered her the bucket, she took one cautious sniff, then backed up so abruptly that the water sloshed over the edge. Her eyes were wide, showing the whites, a rare and unnerving sight. Eli frowned and crouched beside the bucket. The water looked perfectly fine. No smell, no color. Out of stubborn curiosity, he dipped 2 fingers in and touched them to his tongue. It tasted a little different than usual, metallic maybe, faintly sour on the back of the throat. He spat it out and wiped his mouth. He'd drunk from that pond all his life without a second thought, and now even he felt uneasy. Over the next few days, things only grew stranger. Sandra began pacing at night, stomping in her stall as if she could hear something no one else could. The other horses started acting jumpy too, skittish and restless near the water. Even the cows that grazed by the shore now approached cautiously, their ears flicking nervously. Eli walked the perimeter one evening and found a dead trout floating near the edge, and its belly pale and bloated. He knelt beside it, nudging it gently with a stick. The fish disintegrated at the touch, its flesh soft as pulp. That wasn't right. That night, he hardly slept. The image of the rotting fish wouldn't leave his mind. He thought about the yellowed reeds, the oily sheen he'd seen glinting on the surface earlier that day. And he thought about his grandfather's stories, how the old man used to talk about strange smells and colors in the soil after the factory upriver closed. Henry Brown had dismissed it as ghost talk, the kind of thing farmers told to make sense of bad harvests. But what if there had been truth in it? What if something had been buried there long before his family arrived? When morning came, Eli decided to walk the property line along the creek that fed the pond. It was a narrow stream, sluggish and half dry from the drought. The banks were cracked and lined with weeds, but in some places the mud shimmered faintly under the sun, like oil slicks on asphalt. He crouched and ran his fingers through the damp soil. It smelled faintly chemical, sharp and wrong, not the scent of ordinary earth. He followed the creek upstream until it disappeared behind a ridge where the land flattened into the next property. His neighbor, old Mr. Kramer, had built a small dam years ago to divert water for irrigation. Maybe that had something to do with it. But Eli knew the taste of bad water. This was something else. By the end of the week, Sandra refused even to leave the stable if he led her in the direction of the pond. Her muscles would stiffen, her head toss violently, nostrils flaring with something close to panic. Eli began drawing water for her from a hand-dug well behind the house. She drank it eagerly. That alone told him everything he needed to know. The horse wasn't sick. The water was. He thought about calling Dr. Roberts again, maybe asking him to test the pond. But the man would only laugh, and the cost of a full analysis was far beyond what Eli could afford. The drought had already eaten half his savings, yet every instinct screamed that something poisonous lay beneath that still surface. Each night, as he sat on the porch listening to the frogs that no longer croaked and the crickets that no longer sang, he could almost hear the silence pulsing from the pond. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. A faint metallic tang now lingered in the air around it, especially when the wind blew from the south. Even from the porch, he could smell it sometimes, faint but distinct like rusted metal and rain-soaked wires. Once, in the twilight, he thought he saw the faintest shimmer rising from the water, as though the pond exhaled its own mist. The sight made his skin crawl. Then came the day he noticed the grass dying. It started near the western bank, where the cattails had already turned brittle and brown. Within days, the yellowing spread outward like a slow-moving fire, seeping into the pasture where the horses grazed. Eli dug up a clump of soil with his boot heel. It was damp and dark, but when he crumbled it in his hand, a greasy residue stuck to his palm. He wiped it off on his jeans and stared at the spreading patch of dead land. Whatever was happening wasn't natural. He began to remember small things from his childhood, stories whispered around dinner when the grown-ups thought he wasn't listening. His father once mentioned that the pond used to be deeper, much deeper, before the rains came less often. His grandfather had said it was man-made in part, though he'd never explained what that meant. It had always been there, long before Eli was born. Maybe it wasn't a pond at all, not in the true sense. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table long after sunset, the house dim except for the small lamp flickering over a pile of old papers. He had dug out the family chest from the attic earlier that day, a heavy trunk of yellowed deeds, tax receipts, and letters written in faded ink. He unfolded a brittle map that showed the property boundaries from 70 years ago. On the far edge of the land, near the creek, a faint square was marked in red pencil. Reservoir. He stared at the word for a long time. A reservoir built for what? By whom? His grandfather's old ledger mentioned something else, too, scrawled in the corner of a page. Purchased after factory closure, 1964. Soil reclamation promised. Reclamation. Eli leaned back in his chair, the word echoing in his head. It sounded harmless, bureaucratic even, but it hinted at something buried, something meant to be restored or forgotten. The silence of the ranch pressed in around him. Outside, the moon cast a dull sheen over the pond, making it look almost beautiful, like a silver coin resting in the earth. He felt a deep unease looking at it through the window. A man could go his whole life believing his land was clean, his water pure, his home safe. And yet, beneath the surface, the truth might rot unseen. He couldn't shake the image of Sandra trembling at the sight of her own reflection. Maybe, in her own way, she had seen what he could not. That night, the decision began to form in his mind. Heavy, slow, inevitable. If no one would help him, he would find out the truth himself. He didn't need laboratories or government officials. He had tools, machines, his own 2 hands. He had time, and a stubborn streak older than the fences that marked his land. When the first light of dawn crept across the fields, Eli was already outside, standing by the pond with his arms crossed. The air smelled faintly of dust and iron. He imagined what might lie beneath that still surface. Rocks, roots, old pipes, maybe some forgotten debris from decades ago. Whatever it was, it had changed something in the water, something that frightened every living thing that sensed it. He turned back toward the barn, where the pump sat ready beside a spool of hose and an old generator. The decision solidified like concrete in his chest. He would drain the pond, at least enough to see the bottom. Only then would he know if the land that had fed his family for generations was as honest as it seemed. He looked once more toward Sandra, standing under the shade of the fence post, her mane stirring in the faint wind. She lifted her head and met his gaze for a long moment, unblinking, as if giving her silent approval. By evening, the sky turned red with the promise of another dry day ahead. Eli watched the pond gleam under the sunset and thought of the stories that had traveled through his blood, the ones about survival, about stubbornness, about truth buried deep in the ground. He knew now that his turn had come to dig it out, no matter what he found waiting underneath. Tomorrow, he would begin the draining. The silence around the ranch deepened, heavy with expectation, as if the land itself knew what was coming. The following morning arrived with a pale sun and the promise of another scorched day. The air hung dry and unmoving, a film of dust lying thick over the ranch. Eli woke before dawn, not because of the alarm clock, but because his mind hadn't rested. The night had been restless, haunted by the low groaning of the windmill and the steady pulse of doubt that throbbed behind every thought. When the first light broke, he pulled on his work clothes, boots caked in yesterday's dust, and stepped outside into the chill that came before the heat. The land was still, the kind of stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the earth itself were holding its breath for what he was about to do. The pump sat beside the barn where he had left it the day before, a heavy industrial machine with coils of rubber tubing and the metallic scent of oil clinging to it. Eli checked the fuel, cleaned the filter, and made sure the fittings were tight. He worked methodically, his movements quiet, precise, as though performing some sacred ritual. He knew there was no turning back once he started. If he was wrong, if there was nothing down there but mud and rocks, he'd look like a fool. But if he was right, if something was poisoning his water, he had to see it with his own eyes. Sandra stood in the shade of the corral watching him in silence. Her head was high, ears twitching with alert curiosity, and her tail flicked impatiently against the flies. Eli gave her a small nod before turning toward the pond. He walked down the slope with the first coil of hose over his shoulder, the crunch of gravel under his boots echoing in the empty air. The water looked the same as ever, calm, placid, glassy. The surface reflected the sky so clearly that he could see the clouds drifting above, white and innocent. For a moment, he hesitated. There was something unsettling about disturbing that stillness. It felt wrong, almost like breaking a promise made long ago by the land itself. But the memory of Sandra's trembling, of the dead fish dissolving under his stick, of the yellowed grass creeping outward from the banks, hardened his resolve. He primed the pump, adjusted the intake line, and started the motor. The machine sputtered for a moment, then roared to life, belching a puff of gray smoke. The hose trembled, then began to suck at the surface of the pond with a low, steady gurgle. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The water line barely moved. Eli sat on a rock and watched, listening to the rhythmic cough of the motor. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, burning the back of his neck. The air shimmered. Gradually, a faint change appeared, the water level lowered by an inch, then another. The edge of the pond pulled back from the reeds, exposing slick mud glistening in the light. The smell grew stronger, too, faintly sour and metallic. It wasn't the smell of natural decay. It was sharper, colder, something manufactured. He shut the motor off at noon to let it cool and ate his lunch sitting by the barn, a few pieces of bread and cold beans straight from the can. His neighbor, a wiry man named Blake Kramer, drove by on the dirt road and slowed his truck, squinting towards the sound of the machine. "What in the hell are you doing, Eli?" he called out. Eli wiped his mouth and shaded his eyes. "Draining the pond. Water's gone bad." Blake laughed, a dry, condescending sound. "You're wasting your time. It's the heat. Water goes stale in a drought, that's all. You'll have nothing but a hole full of snakes when you're done." "Maybe," Eli said quietly. The other man shook his head and drove on, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the still air. Eli sat for a long moment, watching it settle before returning to the pump. The sound of the engine soon filled the silence again, steady and mechanical, like a heartbeat echoing across the empty fields. By evening, the water had dropped nearly a foot. The edges of the pond revealed things that had been hidden for years: smooth stones, tangled roots, and half-buried debris from old storms. Eli noticed how the mud had turned a darker shade of brown, almost black, and how the air around the exposed area shimmered with heat. He stepped carefully along the perimeter, his boots sinking into the soft ground, and felt the faint vibration of the pump through the soles. When he crouched, he saw thin threads of oily residue coiling on the surface, rainbow-colored under the light. He turned off the motor and stood there, breathing heavily. The smell of chemicals was stronger now, unmistakable. Something unnatural was leaching up from below. He could feel it in his throat, a faint burn when he inhaled. He spat into the mud and wiped his face with his sleeve. The decision he had made, once born of curiosity, was beginning to feel like something far more dangerous. That night, the sound of the generator echoed across the valley long after the sun went down. The distant ranches would hear it and wonder what he was doing. Maybe some would laugh. Maybe others would shake their heads and mutter that Eli Brown had finally lost his mind. But none of them had seen what he'd seen. None had felt that thick, acrid air. None had watched their animals recoil from the very water that kept them alive. He worked into the night, guided by the beams of his pickup headlights. The glare lit the shrinking pond, now a circle of dark sludge surrounded by cracked earth. Frogs that had lived there for years were gone. He realized with a chill that he hadn't heard their croaking in weeks. As he bent over to adjust the hose, a faint rustling came from the far side of the pond. He froze, listening. A coyote, maybe, or something else disturbed by the changing water line. The night was so quiet that even the whisper of wind in the reeds sounded like a voice. By dawn, the water was nearly half gone. The pond's center had become a pool of thick, brown liquid, churning as the pump continued its relentless draw. Eli's arms ached from hauling hose and clearing clogs. His shirt clung to him, soaked with sweat. But he didn't stop. He watched, fascinated and horrified, as the land began to reveal what had been buried beneath its surface. The third day brought the first sign of something solid. Around noon, as he cleared debris from the intake valve, the suction pipe struck something hard. The sound was metallic, a sharp clang that reverberated through the water. He thought it might be an old fence post or a rusted plow left from his grandfather's time. But as the level dropped further, the outline of the object began to emerge. A large curved surface, dull and orange with corrosion. Eli crouched at the edge, squinting through the haze. It was too smooth to be a rock, too symmetrical to be farm equipment. He prodded it with a long iron rod. The metal gave a hollow echo, deep and strange, like tapping on the side of a buried tank. He felt a sudden chill crawl up his spine despite the blistering heat. By the fourth day, the top of the object was almost fully visible. It looked like part of a cylinder, maybe 6 feet across, stretching deeper into the mud. The sunlight reflected off its slick, wet surface, revealing faint markings, numbers and letters too corroded to read. Eli ran his hand over it, feeling the coldness of the metal even under the sun. The smell around it was unbearable now, sharp enough to sting the eyes. His throat itched with every breath. He turned off the pump and stepped back, wiping the sweat and grime from his face. He knew what he should do: call someone, report it, stop before things got worse. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. The sight of that buried cylinder, that strange human artifact sleeping beneath his family's land, rooted him to the spot. The fifth day began before sunrise. The air was cooler, the sky faintly purple. He restarted the pump, its mechanical heartbeat returning to life. As the last of the standing water drained away, more shapes appeared, smaller, rounded forms scattered across the pond's bottom. Eli climbed down carefully, the mud sucking at his boots, and knelt to brush away the muck. What he uncovered made his chest tighten. There were at least 3 large metal barrels lying half buried, their tops sealed shut, each one streaked with rust. On the side of one, faint white paint still clung to the corroded surface. Chem 47. He stared at the letters until they blurred. His pulse pounded in his temples. He didn't know what Chem 47 meant, but every instinct in him screamed danger. He staggered backward, almost slipping, then climbed out of the pit and shut down the pump. The engine sputtered once before dying, leaving behind an unnatural silence that settled heavily over the land. For a long time, Eli stood there, hands on his knees, breathing hard. His mind reeled with questions. Who had put them there? How long ago? Was his grandfather involved, or had the land been sold to him already poisoned? He looked toward the farmhouse, its windows catching the morning light, and felt a wave of anger rise in him. Anger at the deceit, the carelessness, the invisible threat that had waited under his feet for generations. When the wind finally stirred, it carried with it the faint, acrid stench of chemicals. He coughed and turned his face away. Behind him, Sandra neighed softly from the fence line, her body tense, nostrils flaring. She could smell it too. He realized then that the problem was far beyond him. Whatever lay buried beneath that pond was not something a farmer could fix with shovels and pumps. It was something deeper, older, dangerous. The next step would not be his choice alone. Still, he couldn't leave it unfinished. He had come too far. Before walking back to the house, he climbed down once more and touched the cold surface of the largest cylinder. It thrummed faintly under his palm as if holding back a breath. He thought of the clear water that had filled this pond, the animals that had drunk from it, the way the land had always seemed alive. Now it felt hollow, corrupted. When he finally left the site, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting long red shadows across the dry fields. The pond, half empty and reeking, looked like a wound carved into the heart of the ranch. He stopped at the fence line and turned for one last look before heading back toward the house. Tomorrow, he decided he would make a call to the county office, to anyone who would listen. Whatever secrets the earth had kept buried were no longer content to stay hidden. The truth was surfacing, slow and patient, like the rusted bones of something terrible waking from its long sleep beneath the mud. Eli didn't sleep the night after he found the barrels. His mind was a wheel that refused to stop turning, grinding over the same questions again and again. The image of the rusted metal cylinder haunted him, the strange code scrawled across its surface, the foul stench that seemed to cling to his skin even after he'd scrubbed it off. He tried to convince himself it was just old junk, maybe leftover equipment from a forgotten irrigation project, but deep down he knew better. The smell of chemicals was too sharp, too artificial, and the way the soil darkened around the exposed metal didn't seem natural at all. Before dawn, he was already outside again, boots crunching over the hardened dirt, the air cool enough to sting his lungs. The stars were still visible overhead, faint in the pre-dawn haze, and the pond below him lay like a wound, half drained, rimmed with a ring of cracked mud and dead reeds. The water that remained was thick, brown, and motionless. He could see the curve of the largest cylinder glint faintly beneath the lantern light, slick with slime and streaked with corrosion. For a while, he just stood there, staring, feeling the land's silence pressing down on him. Then he moved closer, kneeling at the edge of the pit. The smell hit him again, metal, oil, and something sharper, like burned plastic. He gagged and covered his nose with his sleeve. A thin mist rose from the surface of the mud, curling in the cool air. The barrels looked ancient, as though they had been lying there for generations, but something about them felt wrong, almost deliberate. They hadn't been lost or discarded. They'd been hidden. By sunrise, he was pacing near the truck, debating what to do. Calling the sheriff seemed pointless. The man would take one look, declare it farm waste, and drive off. But the situation felt bigger than that, heavier. His grandfather's map flashed in his mind. The faint red square marked reservoir. He realized then what he had uncovered might not just be a family problem. It might be a secret the land had been forced to keep. He fetched his phone from the house and called the county environmental office. The woman who answered sounded skeptical at first, her tone bureaucratic and detached. "Sir, you're saying you found barrels? Could they be fuel drums?" she asked. Eli tried to explain the smell, the markings, the color of the soil, but her responses stayed flat and procedural. "We'll log it. Someone will contact you for inspection." When he asked when, she hesitated. "We're short-staffed. Maybe early next week." "Next week," he repeated, staring at the steaming surface of the drained pond. "Lady, I think there's poison leaching into my ground right now." "I understand your concern, Mr. Brown," she replied in the same rehearsed tone. "But please, do not attempt to move or open any of the containers yourself." Then the line went dead. Eli lowered the phone and stared at it for a long time. He could still hear the hum of the pump cooling behind him, the distant creak of the windmill turning in the faint morning breeze. The silence after the call felt heavier than before. By mid-morning, a pickup truck appeared on the dirt road, kicking up a tail of dust. Two men stepped out, inspectors, judging by their reflective vests and the equipment cases they carried. They introduced themselves as part of the county's environmental division, though their demeanor was tired, cautious, almost perfunctory. The older one, a man with sunken cheeks and gray hair, squinted toward the drained pond. "You said you found barrels?" Eli led them down the slope. The younger inspector wrinkled his nose as soon as the smell hit him. The older one muttered, "Damn," under his breath. They stood there for several minutes, taking photographs and notes, measuring air quality with a handheld device. The beeping of the monitor cut through the silence like a metronome. After a few readings, the older inspector looked at his partner and then back at Eli. "We're going to need to seal this off," he said quietly. "What's in them?" Eli asked. "Too early to tell," the man said, avoiding his eyes. "But whatever it is, it's leaking. You did the right thing calling us." He turned toward the younger one. "Get the containment tape. Nobody goes near this water until we're done." Within an hour, they had roped off the area with bright yellow tape that fluttered weakly in the wind. The inspectors donned protective gloves and carefully extracted small samples of the muddy water into glass vials. Eli watched them work, trying to read their expressions. Every so often, the younger one glanced at him, then back at the older man, as if unsure how much to say. When they finished, the senior inspector approached him. "We'll send these to the lab in Billings," he said. "You'll have results within 48 hours. In the meantime, keep your animals away from this area. Don't use your well either. If this stuff has seeped into the groundwater, he stopped himself, catching the look on Eli's face. Just be careful. They left shortly after, promising to file an official report. Their truck disappeared over the hill, leaving Eli alone once more with the quiet. The yellow tape fluttered in the wind, bright and alien against the dull earth. The next 2 days were the longest of his life. He couldn't bring himself to work the fields. Every time he walked outside, his eyes were drawn back to the pit. The barrels seemed to glimmer faintly under the sun, and sometimes when the breeze shifted, the smell grew stronger again, stinging the back of his throat. Sandra refused to come near the paddock now, pacing the far side of the corral like she could feel something wrong radiating from the earth itself. Even the birds had vanished from the trees. The ranch felt hollow. On the third morning, a white SUV pulled up to the house. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, their shirts pressed, their faces unreadable. One carried a clipboard, the other a black case. They introduced themselves as representatives from the State Environmental Agency, though Eli suspected they were from higher up. Their badges bore no names, only the seal of the Department of Environmental Safety. They walked the perimeter, took additional readings, and spoke in low, guarded tones. When Eli pressed them for answers, they told him only that hazardous materials were present and that federal assistance might be required. He caught fragments of their conversation as they moved around the site. Words like toxic compounds, industrial disposal, and possible contamination radius. The older of the 2 finally turned to him and said, "Mr. Brown, this area is now under investigation. We'll have to restrict access for safety reasons." "You're closing me out of my own land?" Eli asked, his voice rising. "Temporarily," the man said. "It's for your protection and everyone else's." That evening, Eli stood by the fence as the agents drove away, leaving behind new warning signs. Hazardous zone, no entry without authorization. The words stung more than he expected. His family's land, the place his grandfather had bled for, was now treated like a crime scene. He felt the injustice burning inside him like a fever. When the sun set, the pit seemed to glow faintly under the fading light, the damp earth catching reflections from the sky. Eli walked down to the edge, ignoring the tape, and crouched beside the nearest barrel. He traced the faint lettering with his gloved hand, numbers, letters, and a symbol that looked like a warning triangle. The metal was cold even after a full day of heat. A thin film of oily residue stuck to his fingertips. He could smell the chemicals even through the glove. He backed away, coughing, and stumbled onto the dry grass, sitting heavily. He thought of his grandfather, of the pride with which he had spoken about buying this land after the factory shut down. The company had promised reclaimed soil, pure water, and new beginnings. Now, decades later, that promise had rotted into poison beneath their feet. He wondered if the old man had known, or if he too had been deceived. That night, the inspector's warning replayed in his mind. Don't use your well. Don't let the animals near. If it's seeped into the groundwater, the thought made his stomach twist. He remembered how he'd used that water for years, how his family had drunk from the same pipes, how his crops had thrived in the same soil. If the contamination had spread, it wasn't just his land that was at risk, it was the entire valley. At dawn, he loaded his truck and drove into town. The roads shimmered with heat, and the horizon wavered like smoke. He stopped at the local library, one of the few places that still kept public records. For hours, he sifted through brittle documents, land deeds, and industrial permits. The pattern became clear quickly. The factory that had once operated upriver, Harrison Chemical Works, had closed in 1963 after a series of environmental violations. There were reports of illegal dumping, but most of the details were blacked out or lost in transfer. The land had been auctioned off soon after, sold cheap to private buyers. His grandfather's signature appeared on one of the deeds dated a year later. He drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. The past and the present were beginning to merge into something unbearable. He felt betrayed, not just by the company, but by the land itself, which had accepted the poison and kept it secret for generations. When he reached the ranch, the wind had picked up. The yellow tape flapped wildly, and the ground smelled stronger than ever. In the distance, he saw a pickup parked by the gate. His neighbor Blake again. The man was leaning against his truck, watching. "Heard you got the state boys involved," Blake called when Eli approached. His tone carried an edge, something between curiosity and irritation. "They're saying your land's toxic now. That true?" Eli stared at him, exhausted. "Looks like it." "Damn shame," Blake said, though his eyes didn't show sympathy. "You know, if this gets out, it'll hurt all of us. Property values, grazing permits. Hell, buyers will think the whole valley's poisoned. Maybe you should have kept it quiet." Eli didn't answer. He walked past him, up the path toward the house. Blake's voice followed him. "You start digging up ghosts, Eli. Don't be surprised when the dead don't stay where you left them." Inside, the house felt smaller than ever. He sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window toward the pit. The sunlight reflected off the metallic curve of the barrels like a faint warning beacon. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee, which had gone cold hours ago. Everything he had built, everything his family had stood for, was unraveling because of a lie buried decades deep. That night, unable to bear the silence, he went outside again. The stars were bright and cold overhead, and the wind had a metallic taste. The tape around the pit fluttered faintly. For a long moment, he just stood there, listening to the faint hum rising from the exposed ground, a vibration so low it felt more like a sensation than a sound. He realized then that the land wasn't silent after all. It was whispering, a slow, poisoned breath escaping from beneath its skin. And standing there in the moonlight, Eli understood something he wished he didn't. Whatever had been buried here hadn't just contaminated his water. It had stained everything. His past, his family's name, and the future of the valley itself. The truth had surfaced, and it would not sink again. The following morning rose gray and heavy, as if the sky itself carried the same unease that had settled over Eli's land. A thin veil of mist clung to the hills, softening the outlines of fences and barns. The pond, or what had once been the pond, now looked like a scar in the earth, its muddy bottom streaked with streaks of dark residue. The barrels glistened faintly beneath the haze, and the smell of chemicals was stronger than ever, sharp enough to make his throat burn. Even the air seemed to hum with something unnatural, as though the soil itself was alive and restless. Eli stood at the edge of the pit, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The factory records, the barrels, the silence of the officials. The state men had promised to return with a full report, but he knew what that meant. There would be delays, investigations, closed doors, and careful phrasing. He'd seen it before in smaller matters, the way the system moved slowly when the truth was inconvenient. He couldn't wait anymore. He needed answers, not excuses. He drove into town as the sun broke through the mist, painting the distant mountains in pale gold. The road was quiet except for the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. When he reached the county building, he parked behind the library and walked across the street to the archives office. Inside, the air smelled of dust and paper. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, and an elderly clerk sat behind the counter, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "I'm looking for land transfer records," Eli said, his voice low. "From around the 60s. Harrison County District, north property line by Clear Creek." The woman blinked, typed slowly into her computer, and gestured toward a back room. "Section B, Aisle 3. Old paper records, not digitized." He thanked her and made his way down the narrow hall. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering occasionally. The smell of old documents grew stronger as he opened one of the drawers and pulled out a stack of yellowed folders. He worked through them carefully, tracing the history of his land backward through the decades. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. The original deed was dated 1964, signed by his grandfather, Henry Brown, and a company representative whose name was barely legible, J. Thornton, Harrison Chemical Works. There was a note scrawled across the margin in faded blue ink. "Property includes reclaimed soil, former containment reservoir decommissioned." Eli stared at the words until they blurred. Containment reservoir. The phrase sent a cold tremor through his chest. He flipped through the rest of the folder and found a letter addressed to his grandfather from the same company, dated 2 months before the sale. It thanked him for his interest in rural development and assured him that the land has been professionally rehabilitated under federal supervision. He could almost hear his grandfather's proud voice reading those lines aloud to his family, convinced he had made the deal of a lifetime. But those promises had been hollow. The rehabilitation had been nothing more than a burial. Eli dug deeper, pulling out old inspection reports, company memos, even newspaper clippings. A pattern began to form, clear and ugly. Harrison Chemical Works had been one of the largest fertilizer producers in the state during the post-war boom. But after a series of accidents, workers fallen ill, fish dying in nearby streams, the plant had been cited multiple times for illegal dumping. Eventually, it shut down under federal pressure, though no one was ever charged. The land was quietly sold off to private buyers within months. There was no record of any cleanup, no environmental clearance, no official closure statement, just a silence that stretched for decades. He left the building with the files clutched under his arm, his mind burning with anger and disbelief. The wind outside had picked up, scattering dry leaves across the parking lot. As he unlocked his truck, a voice called out behind him. It was Margaret Hill, one of the town's oldest residents who had run the diner for 40 years. She leaned against her car, squinting under the brim of her hat. "Eli Brown," she said, her tone cautious. "Heard there's trouble on your land. Something about chemicals?" He hesitated. "That's what they're saying." She nodded slowly. "I remember that place. Used to be a dumping site long before your granddaddy bought it. Trucks would roll through town at night, no lights, just shadows moving up that road. Folks said they were burying drums of waste. We tried to complain, but nobody listened. The company had friends in the State House." Her words sank deep, confirming what he already suspected. The lie had been deliberate. His family hadn't just inherited land, they'd inherited a cover-up. When he got home, the wind was strong enough to rattle the windows. He spread the documents across the kitchen table, the papers fluttering like restless ghosts. As he read through them again, his fury grew into something colder, steadier. He thought of his grandfather, of how the man had worked himself to death trying to turn poisoned soil into something fertile. He thought of his father, who died believing the land was their legacy, not their curse. And now he thought of himself, standing on the same ground, realizing that every drop of sweat his family had shed had gone into keeping someone else's secret buried. That night, unable to bear the confines of the house, he went back down to the pond. The yellow tape still fluttered weakly, and the barrels glimmered faintly under the moonlight. He crouched at the edge, listening to the faint hum rising from below, and for the first time, he felt something like grief. The land wasn't just poisoned. It had been betrayed, used, forgotten. And he was the last in a long line of men who had loved it enough to die for it. He sat there until dawn, staring at the faint reflection of the stars in the thin layer of remaining water. As the first light touched the horizon, he made a promise to himself. He would not let this be buried again. The next day, he drove to the nearest city and walked straight into the headquarters of Harrison AgriCorp, the modern successor to the old factory. The glass building loomed over the street, its polished facade gleaming like a mirror that reflected nothing of the past. The receptionist looked up, startled by the sight of a dust-covered rancher walking through the marble lobby. "I need to speak with whoever runs this place," Eli said. His voice carried a quiet authority that made her hesitate before answering. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but you'll want to hear what I've got." Minutes later, he was sitting across from a man in a gray suit. Corporate Affairs Director, according to the brass nameplate on the desk. The man's smile was polite but shallow. Eli laid the old documents on the table between them, spreading them out carefully. "You people sold my grandfather poisoned land," Eli said. "You buried toxic waste under our pond and called it reclamation. My animals nearly died drinking that water. You're going to explain why?" The man's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered briefly toward the papers. "Mr. Brown, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Those records are decades old. Our company didn't even exist under that name until the 70s. Different name, same people," Eli said. "You can change the logo, but the poison's still yours." The executive sighed, folding his hands. "I understand your frustration, but this matter would fall under the jurisdiction of the original entity, which no longer operates. Legally, our company isn't responsible." Eli stared at him in disbelief. "You think I care about legal? You buried death under my land." The man's tone hardened. "Mr. Brown, I strongly advise you not to make accusations without proof. If you have concerns, I suggest you contact the Environmental Protection Agency. But you should also know that making public statements like this could expose you to liability for defamation." Eli felt the blood drain from his face. The threat was quiet, deliberate, wrapped in politeness. He gathered the papers, shoving them back into the folder. "You'll hear from me again," he said. As he stepped out of the office into the glare of the city, he realized just how deep the rot went. The men who had dumped that waste were long gone, but their successors still guarded the secret as fiercely as ever. When he returned home that evening, the sky had turned the color of tarnished copper. Sandra stood at the far end of the pasture, watching him. The wind carried the faint metallic tang of the pit. He walked toward the fence and leaned on it, exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. The papers were still on the seat of the truck, their corners curling in the dry air. He knew now what he had to do. The state and the company would drag their feet for years, burying the truth in bureaucracy. If justice was going to come, it would have to start with him. He spent the next several days gathering every document he could find: old photos of the ranch, letters from the county, even recordings of the inspector's warnings. He contacted a journalist he'd once met at a livestock auction, a woman named Sarah Keene, who had written about environmental scandals before. When she picked up the phone, he told her everything. By the time the sun set that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: a flicker of hope. Not peace, not yet, but the faint sense that the land's silence might finally be broken. The past had come crawling back from its grave, and this time he wouldn't let it be buried again. Outside, the wind had stilled. The ranch lay quiet beneath the stars, and for a brief moment, Eli imagined he could hear the earth breathing again, not with poison, but with the first fragile promise of redemption. The article came out 2 weeks later under the title "The Poisoned Heart of Montana: One Rancher's Fight for the Truth." It appeared first online, then in the Sunday print edition of the Western Chronicle. Within hours, the phones started ringing. At first, it was neighbors, confused and anxious, demanding to know if what they'd read was true. Then came the calls from reporters, environmental groups, and lawyers, all eager to attach themselves to the story. And after them, the threats started. Eli had expected some pushback, but not the ferocity of it. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night, trucks idling at the edge of his property, headlights cutting through his windows. A rock through his porch light one evening, shattering it into a spray of glass. He began sleeping with his shotgun propped against the wall beside the bed, though he doubted he'd ever need to use it. The intimidation wasn't about violence, it was about silence. The county officials called him into a meeting the following Monday. The building was half empty, the air inside heavy with stale coffee and caution. 3 men sat behind the table: Commissioner Avery, a local lawyer representing the state's Environmental Bureau, and a man in a dark suit from the Department of Agriculture whose name Eli didn't catch. They were polite at first, speaking in rehearsed tones about public concern and the importance of cooperation. But underneath the civility, Eli could feel the hostility. They blamed him for making the story public, for creating panic and damaging the county's reputation. He let them talk until they ran out of euphemisms. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table, and said quietly, "You're angry because I told the truth, but you're not angry at the people who poisoned the land. You're angry at the man who found out." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The man from the Department of Agriculture adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "Mr. Brown, these matters are complex. The contamination occurred decades ago, long before current regulations, assigning liability." Eli cut him off. "You think I care about liability? My grandfather's buried out there, on land that man died believing was good and honest. My water's poisoned, my fields are dying, my animals almost did too. You think I'm going to sit here and let you tell me it's complicated?" The commissioner's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone, Brown." Eli stood. "No, I think you've all been watching yours for too long." He walked out before they could respond, the sound of his boots echoing down the corridor. Outside, the wind was sharp and cold, carrying with it the faint scent of snow from the northern peaks. He stood by his truck for a long time, letting the anger drain out of him until only exhaustion remained. The fight had begun, and he knew now it wouldn't end quickly. That night, Sarah Keene, the journalist who had written the article, called him from Billings. Her voice crackled through the static. "You stirred up a hornet's nest, Eli," she said. "They've opened a federal inquiry. The EPA's sending a team out next week." "Good," he said. "Maybe they'll finally do something." "Maybe," she replied, "but you need to be careful. Harrison AgriCorp's got friends in high places. They've started pushing back. Legal threats, PR spin, the whole playbook. They're trying to paint you as an unstable farmer with a grudge." He laughed bitterly. "That's funny. I thought they'd go with heroic whistleblower." "Eli," she said softly, "they're scared. That's why they're fighting so hard. Keep your head down and don't go anywhere alone for a while." He promised he would, though he knew it was a lie. The days that followed were a blur of reporters and officials. Trucks with government logos arrived at the ranch, men in protective suits roping off more land, drilling test wells, setting up equipment that hummed day and night. The smell of chemicals thickened as they dug deeper, uncovering not just one cluster of barrels but dozens stretching beyond his property line. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Layers of waste sealed under clay, leaking slowly into the water table. The contamination reached miles downstream. When the EPA representative finally approached him, she spoke in the careful language of bureaucrats, promising long-term remediation efforts and potential assistance packages. But when Eli asked about responsibility, who would pay for the cleanup, who would face charges, she gave the same answer as everyone else. It's complicated. By the end of the month, the state declared his ranch an environmental hazard zone. A white notice was nailed to his fence post, stamped with official seals and unreadable legal jargon. He wasn't allowed to grow crops or graze animals. He wasn't even allowed to live in his own house. The land his family had built their lives on was now a forbidden place, a patch of poisoned earth owned by no one and guarded by silence. He packed what he could into the truck, some clothes, tools, the old family Bible, and Sandra's saddle, and drove into town to stay with a friend. The road behind him felt endless, stretching into the gray horizon. Every mile he drove was another piece of his history slipping away. News crews followed the story relentlessly. Some called him a hero, others a troublemaker. Local talk radio split down the middle, half the callers demanding justice, the other half accusing him of ruining the community's economy. Even the neighboring farmers, once friendly faces at Sunday service, began avoiding him. When he walked into the feed store one morning, conversations stopped mid-sentence. The clerk, a young man who used to chat with him about horses, wouldn't meet his eyes. That isolation cut deeper than any official order. For generations, his family had been part of this land, woven into its seasons and soil. Now he was treated like a stranger, an intruder. He'd uncovered the truth, and for that they hated him. One night, he returned to the ranch despite the warnings. The gate creaked in the wind as he pushed it open, the metal sign clanging softly against the post. The moon was bright, washing the fields in a pale, sterile light. He walked down to the pit. The barrels were gone now, hauled away by men in suits and masks, but their absence only made the place feel emptier, lonelier. The air still carried a faint metallic tang, and the soil still shimmered faintly where the poison had soaked too deep to remove. He stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. In the distance, a coyote called. The sound was thin, almost mournful. When he returned to town the next morning, he found a letter waiting for him at the post office. The envelope was unmarked, but inside was a single sheet of paper typed on old stationery. "You should have kept quiet. Some things are better left buried." He stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and slid it into his jacket pocket. Whoever sent it didn't understand that fear had lost its power over him long ago. Once you've seen the bones under the earth, nothing above it can scare you. The weeks dragged on. Government hearings were scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Lawyers argued over jurisdiction. The company released statements expressing deep concern, while quietly denying responsibility. In the middle of it all, Eli found himself becoming a symbol, a name people used in headlines and speeches. Activists held rallies in his name. Politicians mentioned the Brown case when pushing for new regulations. Yet, for all the noise, the actual cleanup barely began. It was Sarah who kept the fire alive. She visited often, recording interviews, publishing updates, digging into corporate archives that most people had forgotten. One evening, as they sat in the diner over coffee, she showed him a faded photograph. Rows of trucks lined up outside the old factory, each bearing the same hazardous symbol painted on the barrels. "These," she said, "are the same containers they buried on your land." He looked at the photo for a long time. "You think anyone will ever pay for it?" "Someone will," she said. "Maybe not the ones who started it, but someone." He wanted to believe her. The winter came early that year, bringing a brittle cold that cracked the ground and froze the shallow streams. The pit at the ranch filled with snow, covering the poisoned soil under a thin, deceptive layer of purity. Eli returned often, despite the signs warning him away. He'd stand at the edge and look out over the white landscape, imagining the land as it had once been, lush and alive before greed hollowed it out. He thought of his grandfather again, of the dreams that had died with him and of the strange, bitter inheritance that now rested on his shoulders. The fight stretched into months. The company's lawyers tried to dismiss the case. The county tried to wash its hands of the affair, but Sarah's articles kept coming, each one sharper than the last, each one forcing officials to speak on record. By spring, federal investigators had traced a paper trail: hidden transactions, falsified reports, deliberate suppression of test results. What had begun as one man's complaint became the centerpiece of a national scandal. Eli was called to testify in Helena. He wore his cleanest shirt, the one his mother had sewn years ago, and spoke plainly, his voice steady even as cameras flashed. He told them everything: how the horses refused to drink, how the inspectors tried to silence him, how his family had been deceived. The hearing room was silent when he finished. For the first time, he saw cracks forming in the wall of indifference that had surrounded the truth for so long. But even victory came with loss. When he returned home, he found a notice waiting on his door. His ranch was being permanently condemned. The state offered compensation, a fraction of what the land was worth. He signed the papers without reading them. Some things couldn't be priced in dollars. That night, he sat on the porch of the empty house, staring into the dark. Sandra grazed quietly nearby, her coat gleaming in the moonlight. The fields stretched out before them, silent and scarred. He thought about everything he'd lost: his home, his neighbors, the future he'd built. And yet, beneath it all, he felt something almost peaceful. The truth was out now, and it couldn't be buried again. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain. He tilted his head back and closed his eyes, letting the first drops fall against his face. Somewhere, deep in the earth, the poison still lingered, but above it, the air felt clean for the first time in years. He knew the fight wasn't over, not yet, But he also knew he'd already won the only battle that mattered. He had made the earth speak. And once the earth begins to speak, it never goes quiet again. Spring came slow that year, as though the earth itself hesitated to begin again. The snow melted reluctantly from the ridges, bleeding into the valleys where poisoned soil still lay dark and unhealed. On the land that had once been his ranch, the wind hummed through empty fields, carrying no scent of life, only the faint tang of rust and memory. The pit where the pond had been was now an open crater, cordoned off by fences and warning signs. Bulldozers stood idle nearby, their paint dulled by dust, waiting for the next phase of cleanup. The sound of machines had become the new music of the valley, steady, methodical, and joyless. Eli watched it all from the rise overlooking what used to be his home. He'd returned that morning with no real purpose other than to see it again. The government men were gone for the day, the site quiet except for the occasional call of a crow circling above. He parked the truck near the old fence line and got out, his boots sinking into soft earth that smelled faintly of diesel. Sandra followed him, slower now than before, her mane gray around the edges. She'd grown old with the land, faithful to the end. The house still stood, though stripped of its warmth. Boards covered the windows, and the roof sagged in places where rain had seeped in. Weeds had grown through the cracks of the porch. Yet, even in its ruin, the place carried a kind of dignity, the stubborn endurance of something that refused to vanish quietly. Eli climbed the steps and sat where he'd sat so many mornings before, his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It had been 6 months since the hearing in Helena. The investigation had widened beyond anything he could have imagined. What started with a few rusted barrels buried under a pond had unraveled into a web of corporate deceit spanning decades. Names came out, documents surfaced, and men in suits who'd once denied everything were now appearing on television under the glare of courtroom lights. Harrison AgriCorp had been forced to acknowledge its predecessor's crimes. The company's stock had collapsed, lawsuits had multiplied, and federal prosecutors had announced criminal charges against several former executives. None of it felt like victory. Eli followed the news when he could, but it all seemed distant, sterile. The words, liability, restitution, negligence, sounded hollow compared to the memories tied to the ground beneath his boots. No court ruling could undo what the poison had done. The land might be cleaned, the air restored, but something far older and quieter had been lost. Trust, belonging, the unspoken bond between a man and the soil he calls home. He'd moved into a small rental house on the edge of town after the ranch was condemned. At first, he'd planned to stay only temporarily until things settled, but months passed and the settlement money remained tangled in bureaucratic knots. He took odd jobs, fixing fences, driving supply trucks for nearby farms, but each time he passed the valley, he felt the pull of the place where his life had broken open. Sometimes, he told himself, he came back to check on the progress of the cleanup, but deep down he knew it was more than that. It was grief, drawn to its source. The workers arrived mid-morning, their yellow hard hats glinting under the pale sun. They didn't see him at first, perched on the porch, motionless. They set up their equipment near the crater, unrolling hoses, testing the air. A supervisor pointed and shouted something about soil samples. Eli watched in silence, noting how easily they moved across the ground he'd once known by every contour and stone. To them, it was just another job site. To him, it was the grave of everything his family had ever stood for. He rose finally and walked down the hill. One of the workers noticed him approaching and lifted a hand. "Sir, this area is restricted. the man said politely but firmly. "Can't have civilians crossing the line." Eli stopped a few feet from the fence. "I used to live here," he said quietly. The man hesitated, studying his weathered face. "You're Brown, aren't you? The one who found the barrels?" Eli nodded. The worker's expression softened. "Hell of a thing you did. Saved more folks than you know." Eli looked past him to where the crater stretched wide and raw. "Doesn't feel like saving." "Maybe not," the man said after a pause. "But sometimes saving doesn't look like winning." Eli gave a faint smile. "Maybe you're right." He turned back toward the fence line, the wind tugging at his coat. The smell of turned earth filled his lungs, mixed with the faint sweetness of spring grass trying to grow again. For a moment, he thought he saw movement by the crater's edge, green shoots pushing through the dark soil, fragile but alive. He watched them sway, and something deep within him eased, just slightly. Life had a way of insisting on itself, even through poison. By afternoon, the sky clouded over, and a light rain began to fall. The workers packed up their tools and drove off, leaving the land silent again. Eli stood alone in the drizzle, water dripping from the brim of his hat. The pit shimmered faintly under the rain, its edges softened, the mud rippling like the surface of some sleeping beast. He wondered how long it would take before the earth forgot the scars they'd carved into it. Years, decades, maybe never. He walked slowly back to the truck, stopping by the small marker near the fence. It was nothing more than a wooden post with a rusted plaque nailed to it, installed by the cleanup crews. "Hazardous site, access restricted." Someone, perhaps one of the inspectors, had scratched words beneath the warning with a pocket knife. "Brown Ranch, 1948, 2024. He traced the letters with his fingers, rain mingling with the dirt on his hands. On the drive back into town, he passed the diner where Margaret Hill still served coffee every morning. The windows glowed warm against the gray afternoon. He stopped in out of habit, shaking the rain from his shoulders as he entered. The bell above the door jingled softly. Margaret looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Well, if it isn't the man who made the front page again," she said, pouring him a cup without asking. "Didn't know I had," he said, sliding onto a stool. "EPA announced they're finishing the first phase of cleanup. Said it'll be safe for grazing again in 5 years." She set the cup down. "You think you'll go back?" Eli stared into the dark swirl of coffee. "Maybe," he said, "but it won't be the same land." Margaret nodded. "Land remembers, but it forgives too, when it can." He didn't answer. He drank in silence, the warmth of the mug seeping into his palms. Around him, the low murmur of conversation filled the diner. Farmers talking about weather, prices, and cattle. For the first time in months, no one avoided his gaze. A few even nodded in quiet acknowledgement as they passed. The tide had turned, slowly but unmistakably. They were beginning to understand that he hadn't destroyed the community. He'd saved it, though the price had nearly broken him. When he left the diner, the rain had stopped. The clouds parted, revealing a strip of blue sky over the valley. Sunlight spilled across the distant hills, catching on the wet grass and making it shine. He stood there for a while, letting the light warm his face, before heading back to the truck. Later that evening, as dusk deepened, he returned to the ranch one last time. The air was cool and sweet after the rain, the smell of wet earth rising like a benediction. He parked by the fence and walked down to the crater. The sky above was painted in soft shades of purple and gold. Sandra followed him, her steps slow but steady. He stopped at the edge of what had once been the pond and looked out over the landscape. The machines were gone now. The tape fluttered in tatters, and in the fading light, the water that had begun to gather again in the lowest part of the crater reflected the sky like glass. For the first time, the place looked peaceful. Not healed, not yet, but at rest. He crouched and let his hand dip into the shallow water. It was cold, clean, and smelled only of rain. He stayed like that for a long time, listening to the distant rustle of wind through the grass, the slow rhythm of Sandra's breathing behind him, and the faint hum of the land settling into its new shape. When the first stars appeared, he rose and walked back toward the truck. The world around him was quiet except for the steady sound of crickets beginning to sing again. At the top of the hill, he turned for one last look. The crater shone faintly in the starlight, a mirror of the heavens above it. For a moment, he could almost imagine his grandfather standing there beside him, smiling that slow, proud smile he remembered from childhood. "You did right, boy," the imagined voice said in his memory. "You listened." Eli nodded to the night, his throat tight. "I listened," he whispered. He climbed into the truck and started the engine. The headlights cut a path through the darkness, carving the road ahead into ribbons of light and shadow. Behind him, the land stretched vast and silent, breathing again after years of suffocation. He didn't know where he'd go next, or whether he'd ever return for good, but he carried with him the quiet certainty that something had been restored, not just in the earth, but in himself. As he drove away, the moon rose high over the valley, washing the scarred ground in silver. The pit gleamed faintly, a pool of reflected light, neither grave nor wound any more, but something else entirely, a beginning. And above it all, the stars burned clear and bright, as if the sky itself had been waiting for this moment of stillness, this fragile proof that even poisoned soil could dream of being whole again. If this story kept you watching, hit that subscribe button. There's more coming that'll leave you speechless. Don't miss the next episode, and share this video so everyone sees what really happened.